Josh McAllister.
Thank you, Mr Dowd, and congratulations to my friend for securing this really important debate. I'd like to start just by saying a few words about the context of this debate and the parallels between it and some of the debates in the last century to do with road safety. Despite the car being relatively common as a feature on our roads from about 1900, it wasn't until the 1930s, when there were already 1 million cars on the road, that we decided to introduce an age limit at all on driving. It wasn't until 1983 that wearing a seatbelt became compulsory. At that time, many people, including MPs here in Parliament, argued the law would be impossible to police, was an overreach of the state, and would not save any lives. In fact, when it was introduced, deaths dropped dramatically, and we got the best out of the rise in the motor vehicle. And there is a really strong parallel there between the introduction of those seatbelt measures and what we now see and now need to do as a Parliament when it comes to online safety. The Online Safety Act itself was an incredibly welcome piece of legislation, but it is just the very first and needs to be seen as a stepping stone piece of legislation rather than any destination in its own right. And I think most people involved in the creation of the legislation, and actually those at Ofcom themselves, would probably recognise that description. Where we need to go next, I believe, is in addressing issues of excess screen time and social media use and those wider harms around the fact that the average 12-year-old is now spending 21 hours a week on their smartphone. There are obvious harms that come from that the Honourable Member for Darlington highlighted about anxiety, social anxiety, peer-to-peer comparison, the mental health impacts. There are very clear impacts on sleep, and there are also impacts on the classroom. The evidence behind that is also growing. But there's an enormous impact of the fact that those 21 hours a week used to be spent by children doing other stuff. Children used to do other things that they're now not doing because they're on these devices, and it presents a complete generational rewiring of childhood, which needs to be considered very importantly. That's why it's really welcome. Last week, the government announced that they will be commissioning a study into this specific area. The evidence has moved on considerably since the Chief Medical Officer last looked at this in 2019. I believe if fresh eyes were looked at the evidence now, very different advice would be given by the Chief Medical Officer. That's why I've introduced the Safer Phones Bill, and I would like 3 things to happen. One is to raise the age of digital consent for data sharing from 13 to 16, which would not just put the Ofcom in a position to regulate this, but also the Information Commissioner's Office. And I'd like extra powers for groups of parents to come together to ensure that's enforced. Secondly, Ofcom do need additional powers to make sure that they can go beyond just the content, as my honourable friend mentioned. And finally, we need to look at this as a public health issue as well as a tech regulation issue.
Thank you. Victoria.